then one thing you touched on it earlier on, and I'm going to kind of wrap two things into this. The first thing is this EPOC, this excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Like this is something that people use to rationalize why they choose, you know, high intensity interval training over lower intensity training, right? And this EPOC, it really only accounts for a potential extra, like some people call it the afterburn effect. So you exercise and then you create this like, you know, oxygen deficit, we'll say, and then in getting that back, you know, back to a level that is sufficient, and then also, you know, we'll call it fixing any of the metabolic disturbances that have occurred due to you doing that resistance training. And like Gary said earlier on, like you often see people do, or sorry, I said resistance training, I meant high intensity training. So you often see people do their high intensity training, high intensity interval training, and then all of a sudden they're like, cool, I'm stopped, but their heart rate is still elevated for potentially hours afterwards, right? So there are some like metabolic changes that are clearly occurring and then, you know, being propagated going forward, right? So you effectively do burn some extra calories after that training session, that high intensity interval training session, that you don't necessarily burn when you do a low intensity training session, right? And this is again something that you potentially want to pay attention to. Like that might be something that you need to account for given your goals, but it really only accounts for 6 to 15% of the calories burned during that exercise. And you might think, wow, that's actually, you know, quite a lot, right? That's, you know, on average. Some people are getting less than that. Some people are potentially getting more than that. Again, depends on your fitness level, depends on a few other things. However, like, as I said earlier on, like if we were to use that same kind of thought process of like, oh, I'm going to do high intensity interval training because it's going to have this afterburn effect. Like if you're only burning like 100, 150 calories at the end of your resistance training because you did a high intensity session, like that's an extra like 6 to 15 calories. You know, it's like, that's not that much. You know, it's like, this is, you know, like you could be like, oh, wow, 6 to 15%. It sounds like a huge amount. But when you actually look at the numbers, it's like, this is literally a lick of a fucking Weetabix. You know, it's like this is nothing. You know, so you know, does it really matter? Now you might say, wow, okay, if that's the case, I'm going to do an actual 40-minute high intensity interval training session. And then I'm going to get 6 to 15% of that. And it's way bigger. It's like, wow, we get this huge burn. Like maybe you know, you say, I'll be able to burn 1,000 calories in this 40 minutes of high intensity interval training. But again, we come back to that problem that no one's able to do 40 minutes of high intensity interval training. You know, it just becomes low intensity or even just this weird moderate intensity. And as a result, you're not getting this EPOC. You're not actually getting the effect that you want to get once you start going past this point and it becomes more aerobic than anaerobic, right? So in my mind, I'm like, we shouldn't even be focusing on this EPOC, right? It's actually even like if we want to really get into like the biochemistry of it and you get into like metabolic equivalence and everything like that, it's like it's actually very poorly supported by the actual research. So in my mind, I'm like, look, just forget it even exists. You might get an few extra calories burnt from your high intensity training, but in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of fucking irrelevant.
Yeah, I agree. Again, it's not something I would base training rationale on, so I agree.